December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes. Snow fell in slow, silent waves, blanketing the forest in white, masking movement, muting sound. Beneath the canopy of frozen pines, smoke drifted low to the ground, curling around trunks scarred by shrapnel and gunfire. The world seemed still, but the stillness was deceptive. Somewhere in that forest, engines idled under canvas, steel tracks creaked against ice, and men waited for orders that would decide who lived and who did not. Among them was a single tank from the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, a battered M4A3 Sherman with a scarred hull and a star barely visible under layers of frost. The men inside had gone days without warmth or rest. The air inside the steel box was thick with the smell of oil, cordite, and sweat. They were part of what had been a platoon. Now, they were alone. To the west, the town of Hatan lay shrouded in smoke. The roads were choked with wrecked vehicles. Jeeps overturned in ditches, trucks frozen in place, their wheels half buried in snow. The German offensive had struck like a storm. In less than 48 hours, the lines had buckled. Armor and infantry poured through gaps that were never supposed to exist. The Allied command called it a counterattack. In truth, it was a rout. The Sherman's engine throbbed softly beneath the snow-caked armor plates. It was a sound both mechanical and alive, a heartbeat of iron in a forest of ghosts. Around it, the trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with ice, their roots hiding the frozen bodies of men caught in the first shock of battle. At first, no one saw the enemy. The fog hung thick, gray, impenetrable. Then, through the drifting snow, came the low, resonant hum of another machine. A deeper growl, deliberate and patient. The men recognized it instantly. It was not one of theirs. Somewhere ahead, beyond the fog, a German Panther was moving through the trees. Its massive Maybach engine pushed against the silence like thunder behind a curtain. The Sherman crew couldn't see it, but they could feel it, a vibration in the ground, faint, rhythmic like the approach of something ancient and relentless. The commander, a young officer from Pennsylvania, looked out through the narrow periscope slit, eyes scanning for any flicker of movement. To his right, the gunner adjusted the elevation on the 76mm main gun. The loader's hands trembled slightly as he pressed another shell into the breech. Outside, the temperature hovered near zero. Inside, it felt colder still. Every creak, every whisper of metal against metal felt amplified. The tank was not just a weapon now. It was a coffin waiting to be sealed. The Ardennes was alive with the sounds of unseen things. Cracking branches, distant artillery, the faint moan of the wind through shattered trees. Above it all, the war moved on, indifferent to those caught beneath it. When the German line had first broken through, the 3rd Armored Division had been scattered across the Belgian countryside. They were supposed to be in reserve, resting after months of grinding advance through France. Instead, they were thrown back into the fight with half their numbers and almost none of their fuel. Entire units vanished in the fog. Roads that had been secure were now crawling with enemy armor. The front was no longer a line, it was chaos. This Sherman, call sign Lucky Lady, had been cut off during a withdrawal. A bridge near Werbelmont collapsed under shell fire, leaving them stranded with only a handful of infantry who had since been captured or killed. For 2 days, they had fought alone, retreating deeper into the forest, burning whatever fuel they had left to stay warm. Now, as dawn broke over the frozen horizon, the crew knew they were surrounded. Radio contact was gone. Their fuel was nearly empty. Their ammunition, down to a handful of high-explosive shells and machine gun belts. The Panther they heard in the distance was not alone. Somewhere behind it, more engines echoed faintly. The enemy was closing in. The crew didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was its own language. Resignation, courage, and something else. A quiet understanding that whatever came next, it would be met head-on. The tank's armor was thin compared to the enemy's. Its gun was weaker. Its tracks were worn. But the men inside had survived too much to surrender now. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft flakes landing on barrels, hatches, and helmets like ashes. Somewhere far behind, American artillery fired sporadically, blindly, desperately, trying to stem the tide. The sky glowed faintly with each explosion, then returned to gray. The Panther emerged first, a shadow in the mist, dark and angular, its turret turning slowly. It moved with the confidence of something that knew it was superior. The Sherman's gunner held his breath, sighted through the optics, and waited. Distance, 200 yards. The rangefinder wavered in the haze. The wind carried the faint metallic echo of chains and track links. The Sherman fired first. The shell tore through the fog, a flash of orange and white against the dull morning light. The recoil shook the tank like a heartbeat. The round hit the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheted, sparking off into the snow. The enemy halted. For a heartbeat, the forest went silent again. Then the German gun returned fire. The explosion hit so close that snow erupted in a white cloud around the Sherman. Shards of wood and ice hammered the hull. The crew's ears rang. A second shot followed. Even closer, the ground trembled, the air filled with smoke. The gunner readjusted, his hands steady now, his world reduced to a crosshair and the slow rotation of an enemy turret. He fired again. The round struck lower this time, below the glacis, near the road wheels. A plume of smoke burst from beneath the Panther's hull. It shuddered, stopped, and began to reverse. For the first time, the Sherman's crew saw fear in the machine that had haunted them through the fog. Snow mixed with smoke as the two tanks faced each other across 100 yards of forest. The Panther fired one last time. The shell missed high, clipping the branches of a pine that shattered like glass. Then the fog swallowed both machines again. For hours, nothing moved. The Sherman sat silent under its layer of frost, a steel monument in a world gone still. Inside, the men waited, hearing only the ticking of cooling metal, the faint creak of branches above. The Panther was gone, or destroyed, or waiting. They could not tell. As night fell, the forest turned black. The cold deepened until the air itself seemed to freeze. Somewhere out in that darkness, the war continued. Columns moving, lines shifting, men dying by the hundreds. But here, in this small pocket of the Ardennes, one Sherman still breathed. And though its engine was failing, though its crew was alone, it had not yet died 3 days earlier. The forest had been quiet. The 3rd Armored Division, known as Spearhead, had been stationed near Stahlberg, resting after months of combat that stretched back to Normandy. Their Shermans, Pershings, and half-tracks were lined up in muddy motor pools, engines cold, crews sleeping inside barns or churches converted into billets. The war, they thought, was in its final act. The Germans were beaten, retreating toward the Rhine. The Ardennes was a quiet sector, thinly manned, a place to recover before the final push into Germany. Then, before dawn on December 16th, the earth shook. The sky lit up with artillery flashes stretching from Monschau to Echternach. In seconds, the illusion of calm evaporated. Shells slammed into supply depots, convoys, and crossroads. Columns of German tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers poured out of the forests under cover of fog. Thousands of infantry followed, wrapped in white camouflage. Hitler had gambled everything on a single, desperate offensive to split the Allied lines, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It was a last throw of the dice, a final gamble made with dwindling reserves. The Allies called it the Ardennes Offensive. History would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. By the second day, the front had dissolved. Communications failed, supply lines were cut, and the Germans were advancing faster than intelligence believed possible. In some sectors, American units were overrun before they even knew the offensive had begun. The 3rd Armored Division was ordered south to stem the tide, to hold critical roads that led through the Ardennes toward the Meuse River. The Shermans rolled out in columns through sleet and snow, their olive drab hulls quickly coated in frost. Engines groaned, treads squealed against frozen mud. Every bend in the road could be an ambush. Every ridge could hide an enemy gun. The winter weather grounded Allied aircraft. No reconnaissance, no cover from above. It was armor against armor, man against machine, in one of the harshest winters Europe had ever known. Lucky Lady was part of B Company, 32nd Armored Regiment. Her crew had been together since Normandy. Sergeant William Hanley, the commander, Corporal Joseph Red Connors, the gunner, Private First Class Ellis Ward, the driver, Technician 5th Grade Frank Kowalski, the loader, and Private Michael O'Reilly, the assistant driver and bow gunner. They were not heroes in their own eyes, just men trying to stay alive long enough to see home. They had fought across hedgerows, through fillets, and into Germany. They had seen friends burned alive inside tanks, towns leveled to ash, and convoys obliterated on roads they'd driven the day before. They had learned to keep moving, to trust the machine beneath them, and to make peace with the fact that death often came without warning. By mid-December, their Sherman was worn down but still running, its armor scarred, its transmission sluggish, its machine guns fouled by mud. They joked that she was held together by hope and spare parts. Yet when the German offensive struck, Lucky Lady was one of the few tanks in their company still operational. On December 17th, they were ordered toward the crossroads town of St. Vith, a key junction controlling access to the Meuse. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to 50 yards. Convoys stalled on narrow roads. Engines overheated. In the confusion, entire battalions vanished into the white. The 3rd Armored fought its way south, encountering scattered resistance. First infantry patrols, then armored spearheads. Panthers prowled the woods like predators, their 75mm high-velocity guns punching through Shermans at ranges where the Americans' 76mm rounds bounced off. The men learned quickly that survival depended on speed, positioning, and luck. A stationary Sherman was a dead Sherman. On December 18th, Lucky Lady was part of a small task force sent to reinforce Hautan, a village straddling the main supply road. The Germans were advancing from the east in strength, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division supported by mechanized infantry. The snowstorm grew worse. Maps were useless. Compass bearings were off. Somewhere between Soy and Hautan, the task force came under heavy artillery fire. Shells rained down, turning the road into a cauldron of mud and flame. Vehicles burned, men scattered. A bridge behind them collapsed, cutting off retreat. When the smoke cleared, only one tank still moved, Lucky Lady. The rest were wrecks, blackened silhouettes against the snow. They pushed onward, following the sound of distant gunfire. For the next 24 hours, they fought alone, ambushing German half-tracks, engaging isolated patrols, retreating deeper into the woods each time. The radio went dead sometime during the night. Fuel ran low. Their rations froze solid. By the morning of December 19th, the tank's crew knew they were cut off. The forest stretched for miles, silent except for the groan of trees in the wind. Smoke hung low, drifting through the snow. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the rest of the division was regrouping. But here, in this pocket of no man's land, the war belonged to 5 men and 30 tons of steel. The stakes were larger than they realized. The roads around Hautan were critical to the German advance. If the enemy broke through, they would reach the Meuse and split the Allied front. Every tank, every rifle, every delay mattered. And in that frozen wilderness, Lucky Lady became a roadblock that refused to move. The Sherman's armor was no match for the German guns. It was thinner, more brittle in the cold. But the M4A3 had one advantage the enemy didn't expect: reliability. Even battered and half frozen, the 4GAA engine kept turning. The tank could start in conditions where Panthers and Tigers froze solid overnight. By nightfall, the temperature dropped below -15. The men inside huddled against the cold steel, their breath forming clouds. The fuel gauge hovered near empty. Yet when the distant rumble of German armor echoed again through the trees, they turned the key and the engine roared back to life. They were 5 men lost in a white sea of silence. But they were not done fighting. Not yet. Far to the east, the German High Command celebrated early successes. Columns had reached Stavelot and were pushing toward the Meuse. But not everywhere had fallen. In countless pockets across the Ardennes, American units dug in and refused to yield. Bastogne, Saint-Vith-Clairvaux, and in one forgotten patch of forest, a single Sherman that refused to die. The men inside knew the odds. They had no illusions. But in that frozen world of smoke and snow, something deeper than duty drove them. It was not orders, nor patriotism, nor even anger. It was a kind of stubborn defiance, a refusal to surrender even when reason demanded it. They would hold, as long as the engine turned, as long as the gun could fire, as long as the snow fell and their hearts still beat. The Ardennes had become a graveyard of machines. But for one tank and her crew, it was not yet time to join them. Snow fell thicker as the morning of December 20th dawned, turning the forest into a maze of white shapes and shifting shadows. Lucky Lady crawled through the narrow trails between pines, her engine growling low, exhaust steaming into the cold air. The crew inside shivered, their breath condensing against the steel walls. The temperature had dropped again overnight, freezing the oil lines of abandoned vehicles along the road. German armor stood immobilized in the distance, their engines failed by the bitter cold. But the Sherman moved. Slowly, stubbornly, but it moved. The forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same. Dense thickets, snow-coated branches, ridgelines lost beneath swirling flurries. The tank's tracks carved deep trenches behind it. Inside, the men listened to the muffled world beyond the armor, trying to make sense of the faint booms and machine gun bursts echoing across the hills. It was impossible to tell which direction the front was moving. The lines were fluid now, shifting hour by hour, village by village. Nothing was clear except one fact. They were alone, and enemy armor was close. At mid-morning, they reached a clearing. Smoke rose from a cluster of burned half-tracks near a collapsed barn. Shell craters pocked the snow. Frozen bodies lay scattered across the ground. American infantry pinned by the first wave of the German advance. Their rifles were still in their hands, now locked in place by ice. Tracks led away toward the tree line, the heavy impression of armored vehicles. Panthers, several of them. The prints were fresh. Lucky Lady pressed on, following the tracks northwest toward the ridgeline. The crew knew the Germans were using these narrow roads to flank Hatton. If they broke through, the entire Allied defense to the west would unravel. The forest provided concealment, but also danger. Tanks moved slow in such terrain. Visibility was limited. The first shot often decided the fight. As they rounded a bend, Hamley spotted movement through the periscope. A dark mass ahead, barely visible through the snow. The Sherman slowed. The image sharpened. A Panther sat hull down behind a fallen tree, its long barrel pointed toward the road. Its crew must have been waiting for a larger American force. They had not expected a lone Sherman. Hamley ordered the tank forward a few yards, presenting only the gun shield. Red Connors adjusted the sights, lowering the 76mm gun. The crosshairs wavered, then steadied. The Panther was angled, bad for penetration, but its flank was slightly exposed. A narrow chance. In battles like this, narrow chances were all that existed. The Sherman fired. The recoil slammed through the hull. The shell streaked across the clearing and struck the Panther just behind the road wheel. Sparks and metal fragments burst outward. The Panther shuddered but did not burn. Its turret swung violently toward the sound of the shot. The forest exploded with the sound of its return fire. The Panther's 75 mm round tore through the branches above, spraying the tank with splinters. The shock wave shook the Sherman. The men held their breath. Another second, another shot. Victory or death. Red fired again. This shell struck the same point as before, punching deeper. A plume of black smoke leaked out of a ventilation port. The Panther lurched. Its engine roared, gears grinding. The turret slowed, then froze. Another burst of smoke poured from beneath the hull. A moment later, flames flickered through the lower vents. The crew inside bailed out, desperate to escape the inferno. The Sherman's engine revved again, pushing through the clearing. They knew more German armor would be near. A lone Panther never traveled alone. 2 hours later, the forest came alive with sound. Machine gun bursts cracked from the right flank. Mortar rounds thumped in the distance. Voices in German echoed through the trees. Disciplined, coordinated, confident. The enemy was sweeping the woods, hunting for isolated American units. Whether they had spotted the Sherman or simply sensed its trail, they were closing in. Hanley ordered the tank off the road and into the deeper forest, slipping between the trees. The Sherman crushed saplings and scraped bark from trunks. Branches snapped against the hull. Snow cascaded from boughs, blinding the vision slits. Ward fought the controls, struggling to keep the tank from bogging down. The ground beneath the snow was treacherous. Hidden roots, frozen mud, unseen dips that could trap a 30-ton machine. Hours passed like this, a slow crawl through the woods, always listening, always adjusting direction. Sometimes they heard engines passing nearby, the growl of panthers idling within a few hundred yards. Sometimes they heard boots crunching snow, infantry patrols sweeping the trees. They shut the engine off then, sitting in silence while the creaking of the forest masked the sounds of their breath. Just after sunset, the worst came. As they crept along a ravine, they spotted lights through the branches, the faint glow of campfires. German grenadiers were massing on the ridgeline above them, perhaps a company in strength. Their supply wagon stood in the clearing, horses steaming in the cold. If the Germans noticed the tank, the infantry swarms could disable it with Panzerfausts. The Sherman hugged the ravine wall, nearly slipping into a frozen stream. The engine ran at idle, so low it almost died. They advanced inch by inch, holding their breath each time a German soldier wandered close to the edge. Then a Panzer IV rolled into the clearing, its turret sweeping slowly. The searchlight mounted on its hull flicked across the snow. It probed the darkness, inching toward the ravine. The Sherman stopped. The crew sat motionless, listening to the rumble of the enemy tank mere yards away. The Panzer's light passed across the ravine wall, then toward the forest floor where Lucky Lady crouched beneath branches and packed snow. Had it gone 1 degree lower, it would have caught the glint of steel. But it didn't. The Panzer turned away, its lights fading into the woods. When the Germans finally moved off, the Sherman remained still for long minutes, as if frozen in time. Only when the forest fell completely silent did they move again. They followed a stream north, hidden beneath the canopy. The moon cast a silver light through cracks in the clouds, reflecting off the water and illuminating their path. Sometime after midnight, they emerged onto a narrow road that wound towards Soy. Smoke drifted across the snow. Ruins of farmhouses stood silhouetted against the sky. Blackened rafters, collapsed beams, frozen wells. The tracks of German armor scarred the road. The air stank of diesel fumes and burned metal. They knew they had entered contested ground. Both sides had fought along this road earlier. The wrecks told the story. American half-tracks blasted open by Panzerfausts. A burnt-out Sherman with its turret blown off. A German truck riddled by .50 caliber fire. Everything was quiet now, but it was the kind of quiet that came before another storm. Lucky Lady continued forward, her crew exhausted but alert. They had been awake for nearly 40 hours, surviving on adrenaline and instinct. Their rations were gone. Their water had frozen. Their fuel was dangerously low. But ahead lay the only viable route west, and perhaps the only chance to rejoin the division. Half a mile down the road, the forest opened into a wide curve. On the far side sat a stone bridge over a narrow river. As they approached, Ward slowed the tank. The bridge was intact, too intact. Snow along its surface was undisturbed. No recent tracks, no footprints, no signs of use. It was either abandoned or watched. As they inched closer, Red scanned the ridge above through the cupola. Shapes emerged, dark outlines hidden among the pines. Infantry positions, camouflage nets, and then he saw it, the long barrel of an 88mm gun sticking out between branches, angled directly toward the bridge. The Germans had set an ambush for anyone attempting to cross, using the only passable route for miles. Hanley ordered a halt, the Sherman stopping just short of the kill zone. For a moment, the crew sat in absolute silence, listening to the faint wind across the river. They had discovered the trap, but now the question remained, could they break it? The forest behind them crawled with German patrols. The road ahead was covered by an 88. The flanks were cliffs and frozen water. There was no easy escape. The night deepened. Snow continued to fall. The engine idled, whisper quiet beneath its layer of frost. In that frozen standstill between two worlds, the one behind them, deadly and closing, and the one ahead, deadlier still but passable. The crew realized their fate was tightening like a noose. But Lucky Lady had not survived this long by surrendering to fear. They began to plan. They studied the angles. They calculated the terrain. They measured the distance between life and death in inches. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the ridge, more German armor rumbled. Time was running out. The final stand was coming. Snow fell in heavy sheets as the night deepened, each flake caught in the pale glow of the moon. Lucky Lady sat motionless under the tree line, her engine barely above a whisper, her steel skin coated in frost and soot. Ahead stretched the silent curve of the stone bridge. Beyond it, the faint glimmer of a ridge where the enemy watched with patient calculation. The 88mm gun sat like a predatory creature, its long barrel emerging from the pine branches, angled with perfect precision toward the crossing. Every American crewman who had survived the Ardennes understood the unspoken rule. The first tank to enter that kill zone never left. The Sherman had faced danger countless times over the past 48 hours, but this was different. There was no alternate route, no open flank, no hidden trail through the woods. Behind them, German infantry swept the ravines. South of them, Panthers and Panzer IVs patrolled the roads. To the north, cliffs and iced-over creeks choked the terrain. This bridge, this narrow ribbon of stone over a frozen river, was the only path left. And so the Sherman waited, watching the darkness ahead, listening to the creak of distant trees bending under the winter wind. The crew worked in silence, adjusting their gear, loading ammunition, checking the traverse of the turret. Each man understood what the next minutes might mean. Their fuel gauge hovered near empty. Their shells dwindled. Fatigue had blurred the edges of the world, but the cold kept them focused, alert, sharp. They studied the terrain with the careful patience of hunters, searching for blind spots in the enemy's overwatch. It was a hopeless task. The Germans had chosen their position well. The 88mm sat with perfect elevation, commanding the bridge with murderous efficiency. But the Ardennes was never a battle of perfection. It was a struggle of chance, timing, courage, and the unpredictable chaos of winter combat. And the Sherman had survived this long not by superior firepower or armor, but by a mixture of resilience and improbable fortune. It would need both again now. The men waited until the forest fell quiet, until the distant stomping of boots and the low thrum of engines faded into the wind. Only then did Hanley order the slow advance. The tank moved forward with a low growl, pushing snow aside as it inched closer to the bridge. Frost cracked beneath its treads. Ice shattered under the steel weight. The tank crept forward like a ghost emerging from the woodline, the whitewash camo blending with the snow. The Germans noticed movement immediately. A flare burst overhead, bathing the bridge in a cold blue glow. Shadows sharpened. Branches glistened with frost. The Sherman pressed forward, fully exposed. The 88's crew reacted with disciplined speed, swinging the barrel directly toward the tank. The snowy air trembled with tension. Every heartbeat stretched. Every second counted. The German gun fired. The cracks split the forest like thunder. The armor-piercing shell screamed across the clearing and smashed into the bridge stones inches in front of the Sherman's tracks. Debris exploded upward, showering the tank with fragments. The blast rocked the chassis. The crew braced themselves, knowing the next shot would be true. Hanley ordered full throttle. The engine roared, spitting black smoke into the frozen air. The Sherman lunged forward. The enemy gun's breech clanged as the next round was loaded. Snow blasted behind the tank as it gained speed. It reached the midpoint of the bridge. The Germans adjusted aim. The second round fired. The shell tore through the night, trailing sparks, and slammed into the turret base. The armor dented inward, scorching metal and filling the interior with smoke. The tank shook violently, nearly thrown off course, but did not stop. The Sherman pushed past the kill zone, treads scraping against the stone railings. The 88's crew scrambled to adjust their angle, but the tank was now too close. Their field of fire narrowed. They could no longer depress the barrel enough to hit the target. The Germans cursed and scrambled for Panzerfausts. Infantry rushed toward the edge of the ridge, seeking a clear line of sight. Lucky Lady burst off the far end of the bridge just as a torrent of small arms fire erupted from the tree line. Tracers streaked across the snow, snapping past the armor. The tank careened into the clearing, plowing through drifts of powder as bullets ricocheted off its turret. German grenadiers emerged from the shadows, their shapes barely visible against the pines. A Panzerfaust roared, the molten jet slamming into the Sherman's left side. The blast blew away part of the side skirts and seared the hull. Flames licked the metal. The tank lurched, but kept pushing forward with frantic momentum. The crew worked with mechanical precision, turning the turret toward the source of the attack. The 76mm gun fired point blank, the recoil hammering through the hull. The shell detonated among the grenadiers, scattering snow, branches, and debris. A second Panzerfaust streaked past the tank, missing by inches. The crew loaded another round. Fire spat from the barrel, illuminating the clearing. The Sherman rolled onto the forest path beyond the ridge, its tracks chewing into the snow. They had broken the ambush, but not escaped danger. From a tree line ahead came the unmistakable growl of a tank engine. The sound was deep, resonant, mechanical, the voice of German steel awakening. Shadows shifted through the pines. Snow cascaded from branches as something massive pushed forward. Through the drifting flakes, the shape emerged. A Panther, its long-barreled cannon cutting through the trees like a spear. The Sherman slammed to a halt. There was no cover, no dip in the ground, no obscuring terrain, just a frozen clearing between two apex predators. The Panther angled its glassy plate toward the American tank, presenting its strongest armor. The turret rotated with deliberate slowness, the gun aligning with deadly purpose. The Sherman had only a moment, a single heartbeat of opportunity, to fire before the Panther's superior gun tore it apart. The crew acted as one. Red steadied the sight. Hanley locked the turret. Ward spun the hull toward a slight depression that might offer an angle the Panther hadn't anticipated. The gun boomed, the shell ripping through the falling snow. It struck the Panther's lower front plate, a known weakness, but the angle was too shallow. The projectile glanced off, sparking into the trees. The Panther fired. The round cracked the air with brutal speed. It hit the Sherman's right side, blowing a crater into the armor. Shrapnel carved through the interior, tearing into equipment, but miraculously missing the men. Smoke filled the turret. The heat seared their faces. The Sherman fired again. The second round hit the Panther's mantlet, jarring the enemy's aim, but not penetrating. The Panther's turret recoiled slightly, its gun adjusting downward. The next shot would likely end everything. The Sherman had one option left: movement. A still target would die. A moving one might survive long enough to get the right angle for a kill. Ward threw the engine into reverse, tracks grinding violently as the tank backed toward the tree line. Snow plumed around it. The Panther fired again. The shell tore across the clearing, slamming into a pine trunk inches above the Sherman, splitting the tree in half. The trunk crashed across the tank, showering it with branches. The engine strained, pushing tree limbs aside. The Sherman pivoted left, then surged forward. The Panther tried to track it, but the narrow trees disrupted its traverse. The American tank circled wide, using the forest as a shield, always staying just far enough to deny the Panther a clear angle. The Panther advanced, its heavy engine roaring, its treads flattening trees in its path. Snow churned beneath both machines as they circled each other in a deadly dance beneath the winter canopy. Each time the Panther neared a firing position, the Sherman slipped behind a trunk, a rock, or a ridge. Each time the Sherman lined up a shot, the Panther angled its armor or vanished between the pines. Finally, the moment came. The Panther pushed too aggressively through a cluster of trees, exposing its thinner side armor. The Sherman seized the opportunity. Red aligned the shot with steady hands hardened by exhaustion and adrenaline. Hanley held the turret perfectly still. The gun roared. The shell hit the Panther squarely on the flank, punching through the side plate and igniting the ammunition racks. Flames erupted from the Panther's turret ring. Smoke billowed through the branches. The massive machine groaned as fire devoured its interior. Moments later, the turret popped upward as internal pressure detonated. The German tank collapsed, burning bright against the snow. The clearing fell silent again. No more engines. No more gunfire. Only the crackle of flames and the slow fall of snow. But the danger was not over. The Sherman's engine sputtered. Fuel gurgled at dangerously low levels. The tank limped through the forest, each mile feeling like an eternity. The crew followed the faint glow of artillery flashes on the horizon, knowing American lines must lie somewhere beyond that light. At dawn, after hours of navigating winding forest trails and frozen roads, they emerged onto a ridge overlooking a valley filled with U.S. vehicles, trucks, artillery, medics, armored columns pushing forward to restore the line. The sight was overwhelming. Men rushed toward the tank as it crawled down the slope, smoke trailing from its damaged hull. The Sherman rolled to a stop beside a group of stunned infantrymen. The crew climbed out, exhausted, frozen, blackened by smoke and debris, unable to speak. They had survived the impossible. Their tank, battered, scorched, scarred by battle, had carried them home. Lucky Lady finally shut down, her engine clattering to silence, as if exhaling after a final act of defiance. And in that moment, as snow drifted gently across the field and American soldiers gathered around the wounded tank with awe and disbelief, the legend of the Sherman that refused to die was born. Morning light crept slowly over the Ardennes, dim and colorless through the winter haze. The snow carried a soft golden tint as the sun struggled to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the frozen field where the tank had finally come to rest. Mechanics and medics walked quietly around the Sherman, studying its shattered armor, its scorched paint, the gaping wound in its hull where steel had bubbled from the Panther's last strike. The vehicle stood like a monument, silent, battered, and impossibly alive after what it had endured. Soldiers from nearby units drifted toward the machine as word spread about its journey. A crew had come out of the forest alone, carving a path through enemy lines that larger forces had failed to hold. Men stared at the cracked turret, the torn fenders, the shattered tools still bolted to the hull. They ran gloved hands along the tracks, tracing the dents left by shrapnel and the deep gouges where bullets had ricocheted. The tank looked less like a weapon and more like a survivor, a steel creature that had fought through the cold, the fire, and the darkness and refused to yield. Inside the camp, the crew warmed themselves near a stove for the first time in days. Their faces were gaunt, their uniforms stiff with frozen mud and smoke. They drank from steaming cups, their hands trembling not from fear but exhaustion. They had no words for what they had lived through, and none were needed. The silence that settled around them was heavy with memory of the forest, the bridge, the flare-lit snow, the thunder of the 88, the monstrous silhouette of the Panther emerging from the pines. Outside, officers inspected the Sherman more closely. They marked the armor impacts with chalk. They measured the penetration angles. They examined the tracks for signs of failure that never came. They could only shake their heads at the improbable engineering endurance. The M4A3 Sherman had never been designed to go toe-to-toe with Panthers in a close-quarters duel. Yet somehow this one had. Somehow this one had survived long enough to slip through a tightening net of steel and fire. The tank was hauled to a maintenance yard later that day. Snowflakes settled gently on its cold surface as cranes lifted it from the mud. Its engine, once roaring with desperate urgency, now hung quiet beneath canvas tarps. Mechanics removed the side skirts, revealing twisted metal beneath. They pulled open the hull plates and found shrapnel embedded deep inside the steel. They commented softly that any one of the penetrations could have ended the fight instantly. But fate, chance, had chosen otherwise. In the days that followed, as American reinforcements pushed deeper into the Bulge, the story of the lone Sherman spread across the division. Some told it with awe, others with pride, and others still with disbelief. Men who had survived the chaos of the Ardennes understood the magnitude of such an escape. The forest had consumed entire battalions. It had swallowed armored columns whole. For a single tank to slip through so many threats was a miracle bound to be retold. Reports were filed, logs updated, coordinates and times noted. The route the Sherman took through the forest was traced on maps, each bend and ravine marked with arrows and lines. In a war defined by overwhelming scale, this tiny path carved into the snow became a testament to human resilience amid overwhelming force. The crew of Lucky Lady returned to duty once repairs were underway, assigned temporarily to infantry security until a replacement tank could be issued. But officers across the division made a point to shake their hands, standing before them with quiet admiration. And through it all, the men remained humble. They had done what they had to do. They had survived because there was no alternative. They did not think of themselves as heroes, only soldiers caught in a storm that demanded everything they had left. By early January, when the German offensive finally collapsed and the front began to stabilize, Lucky Lady emerged from the maintenance depot transformed but still bearing her scars. Fresh green paint coated her hull. Welded plates reinforced her flank. A new track segment wrapped around the wheels. Yet mechanics left certain marks untouched. The deep gouge across the mantlet, the burn pattern near the sponson, the indentation at the turret ring where an 88mm blast had nearly punched through. These wounds remained as reminders, preserved with intention, like battle honors etched into steel. Soldiers walking past the tank often paused. Some saluted, others simply stared. It became a symbol of the battle, not of victory, but of endurance, of a refusal to give, and even when the world narrowed to a snow-covered bridge under enemy fire. The Ardennes would soon be remembered for its scale, its brutality, its unrelenting cold. Historians would write about the massive offensives, the armored thrusts, the cities swallowed by winter combat. In that vast landscape of destruction, the story of one Sherman might have faded, but it didn't. In unit journals, in mess tents, in foxholes, and years later in veterans' gatherings, the tale lived on. They spoke of the tank that crossed the bridge under the sights of an 88. They spoke of the crew who outmaneuvered a Panther in the trees. They spoke of a machine that should have died a dozen times but refused to stop. And long after the war, when the men grew old and the memories became distant shapes in the mind's frost, they still remembered the feel of the metal beneath their hands, the roar of the engine in that frozen night, and the sense, fleeting but powerful, that they were not alone inside the steel. The tank had been with them, the forest had been with them, and something larger than chance had guided them through the darkness. For in war, survival itself becomes a kind of defiance. And sometimes, in the midst of winter's deepest cold and the enemy's greatest strength, a single act of defiance can echo far beyond the battlefield. The Sherman that refused to die became one such echo, a reminder that even in the harshest moments of the Ardennes, courage, resolve, and the will to endure could outshine steel and fire. And in the quiet hours at the war's end, when peace returned to the forests and rivers that had seen so much pain, the path that tank cut across the snow remained carved not into the earth, for the seasons erased that long ago, but into the memory of every man who heard the story. A testament to determination, a testament to survival, a testament to the men who refused to yield, and to the machine that carried them home.